Episode 12 of the Basement Brewed Fantasy Football podcast features special guest Ryan Tracy from the Locked On Chiefs podcast, and he joins me today to discuss the Chiefs backfield. Who should we be targeting between Ronald Jones, Clyde Edwards-Helaire, or maybe even somebody else in the backfield? We're also here to talk about the Chiefs wide receiver room. Obviously, with Tyreek Hill out of the picture, we have no idea how that wide receiver room is going to shake out between Juju Smith-Schuster, Marquez Valdes-Scantling, the rookie Skyy, or maybe even the incumbent Mecole Hardman. What about Travis Kelce? What about the Chiefs O-line? What about IDP players we need to be aware of? All of that and more on episode 12 of the Basement Brewed Fantasy Football podcast, which starts right now. Hello, my friend. Welcome to the basement. Welcome back to the basement. I am Mikey Henninger, and this is Basement Brewed Fantasy Football. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for tuning into the best doggone fantasy football show in Franklin, Wisconsin. This is episode 12. And as you know, I've been working on some pretty in-depth NFL team previews from a fantasy football standpoint. I'll drop a link in the description below if you'd like to catch up on some of the recent episodes and recent articles. And if you recall, in episode 9, I took a deep dive into the Kansas City Chiefs, obviously one of the more exciting, one of the more fascinating teams in fantasy football, especially this year with all the turnover. And like always, it's always good to have a expert and a Kansas City Chiefs expert on the call with me. So today we have a very, very special guest. We have Ryan Tracy from Locked On Chiefs, the Locked On Chiefs podcast. He's also with Rogue Analytics. Be sure to give Ryan a follow on Twitter at Ryan Tracy NFL. Thanks for hopping on, Ryan. What's been happening in your world?
Yeah, I appreciate it, man. Just trying to keep up. You know, we do a lot of stuff. It's not just Chiefs oriented with Rogue Analytics. We do all kinds of draft prep. Me and my team go through film review, analytics on all the physiological stuff. I'm a former strength and conditioning coach, so I kind of lean that way anyway.
Sure.
And then NFL33.com is our Substack where we run, team building, front office kind of news and analysis all year long, not just around the draft. So I never really get a day off is what it is.
Yeah, man, I was checking a lot of that stuff out right before this call, right? Rogue Analytics. It looks like there's some insane, athletic playmaker matrices, some film grinding going on over there, film grinding, film grading, a little bit of both. NFL 33 sounds like it's super sweet. I was definitely checking out the YouTube channel on RGR. What does RGR stand for? Is that Ryan Gone Rogue, if I caught that right?
Absolutely. Because I've been podcasting for going on 10 years, right? And I've always had a partner.
Yeah.
I started the YouTube thing just to do my own deal.
Yeah, man, I love it. Everything that I'm seeing looks good, sounds good. It was definitely clear. And for those of you listening, the way that I found Ryan, I actually hopped over to the Chiefs subreddit on Reddit, which can be a scary place at times. And I asked, who's got the best fan based, who's got the best produced Chiefs podcast out there, and Ryan was one of the first and most frequent names that popped up. So I reached out to Ryan, and again, Ryan, I really, really appreciate you hopping on here, man. It's really cool that you took the time to be my second guest. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me, and thanks to Reddit, I guess. Sure.
Yeah, yeah, man. Words getting around. So I know we talked a little bit about this, but you do have a little bit of a fantasy football background. You've played some fantasy football for the last decade or so.
Yeah. I'm going on my third decade of a 10-year dynasty league that I played with the same dudes since in the 90s. Let's put it that way.
Ooh, baby. I love it, man. That sounds so in the 90s. So what are we talking? Like Brett Favre, like Dan Marino? We're talking some real good ones.
Like there was a Gerback sighting back in the day when we started.
Oh, man.
So, yeah, it's old.
Love it, dude.
It's fine.
That's super fun though. I was even looking at a fantasy football notebook from a couple of years ago, like 2016, and there were some names on there that I had completely forgotten about, like Austin Collie and Javid Best. It's just kind of fun looking back and like seeing some of these names that just kind of slipped through the cracks a little bit. So let's dive into the Chiefs and more specifically from a fantasy football standpoint, right? Obviously, it's really, really good to get an expert on the line, somebody who covers the Chiefs more on a day-to-day basis, pretty much. And obviously the Chiefs, especially from a fantasy football standpoint, they're one of the more fascinating teams in the game this year with all of the turnover with Tyreek Hill and adding Ronald Jones. But before we dive into the obvious stuff, I think there's usually a spot that often goes overlooked in fantasy football, and we really can't find a heck of a lot. We look at like PFF's rankings, for example, but the offensive line, right? There's a lot that fantasy football players just don't know about the offensive line because they don't get stats, right? It's not something that you look at in fantasy football. Tell us what we need to know about the Chiefs and what that unit looks like headed into 2022.
Well, any fantasy offensive line, you have to look at one thing, and that's really what it all comes down to. That's pressure percent. How often are you putting your quarterback in a position where he either has to get off of his spot or he has to break the pocket? Mm-hmm. With Mahomes, that's kind of a misnomer because half the time he breaks the pocket just because he wants to. Right. So you get kind of stuck there. The offensive line right now is in a real turmoil because both the tackles are out. Orlando Brown is holding out off of his franchise tag, wants to be the best tackle in football, and every Baltimore Ravens fan out there understands why the Chiefs ain't going to do that. But also the problem is starting right tackle Lucas Niang is out. He's recovering from a patella tendon rupture last season. And so it is rookie Darian Kennard just came out of Kentucky, and stalwart Andrew Wiley, who's played 4 positions on the offensive line since the Super Bowl year. It is really kind of a hunt and peck. Do they move Joe Thuney? There's a lot going on there. But as a unit, your core interior 3 of Creed Humphrey, Trey Smith, and Joe Thuney are rock solid, arguably the best in the league. You got to shore up those tackles so that Patrick doesn't have to run for his life.
Yeah. And you're totally right? With Patrick Mahomes, at least from a fantasy football standpoint, it probably doesn't matter too much because the guy, like you said, he's going to get out of the pocket because he wants to, and then he's going to throw it with his back turned lefty and like over his head and all those things and somehow complete a 90-yard
He's doing
touchdown.
Behind the backs now. I don't know why, but
I did see a clip of that yesterday or 2 days ago. I don't know. Time's a black hole. But what about when it comes to the running game? Would you say that the current, obviously we talked about the tackles and the interior is a little bit stronger, if you will. How would you feel like that is going to impact the running game? And we'll talk specifically about CEH and Ronald Jones here shortly, but how are you feeling about the running game from an offensive line standpoint?
It should be bolstered because this line group is nastier. It's more straightforward. It's more man on man, hat on hat than it is zone, which is what Andy Reid have run over the last few years.
Yep.
But it is tailored to what these athletes are. The question becomes, you're still fighting the Andy Reid effect, and he's not going to go. He's varied in Kansas City between 38% run call and 32% run call. It's not going to go outside of that. You're not going to get a 45% run year from Andy Reid. It's just not going to happen.
Got it. Yep. Okay. That makes a ton of sense. And speaking of that backfield, right? Obviously they added Ronald Jones to the backfield. Hopefully this doesn't come off the wrong way. I made a joke in my article and in my previous podcast that the Chiefs seem to have a penchant for disappointing high draft capital running. I shouldn't say disappointing, but underwhelming high draft capital running backs. How do you see that backfield breaking out between Clyde Edwards-Helaire and Ronald Jones? And is Jerick McKinnon a factor after such a great postseason run last year?
He definitely is a factor. He will be there in the postseason this year. The question is, how much do they regulate him in the meantime in order to protect him from himself? He has tendency to get injured. He's not the most structured guy. You want to have him for the run, right? Now, CH just went on the PUP list yesterday.
Yep.
And that is, as I understand it, a temporary thing. It's not a gross or forbidding kind of injury, but it does slow him down. So I still think in the committee, it's 60, 70% CEH. Rojo will fill in there. McKinnon from time to time. You have rookie Isiah Pacheco that they really like. The question is he going to make the roster as a returner that you have him available? You have to pull him up off of the practice squad each week. He will be there in some shape or fashion. And then the dark horse is Derrick Gore, who actually had a couple of nice games for the team last year, but looks to be on the outside looking in right now. He's a practice squad candidate.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's, you brought up a good point with the young kid, right? The rook, because I think a lot of people in fantasy football circles, at least, it's CEH or is it Ronald Jones, right? And you're starting to see CEH's ADP kind of creep down a little bit, especially with the recent PUP news. And you're seeing Ronald Jones his ADP start to creep up a little bit, but a lot of people aren't thinking about the rookie. They're not thinking about Jerick McKinnon, who I think is a fun little dart throw at the very, very end of fantasy football draft. So it's good to know what you're thinking in terms of how that's going to shake out. I think the one thing that's crystal clear, and I think everybody knows this at this point, so it's not really news, but there's not going to be a workhorse. There's not going to be that 3-down bell cow type of guy.
No, it's the dreaded committee, and that's just the way Andy rolls.
Yep. All right, man. Hopping over to the wide receiver room. This is where things get really, really fascinating, right? Obviously, Tyreek Hill is out. There's not going to be a new Tyreek Hill. Somebody's not just going to step in and fill those shoes and be that guy. It's going to be a collective approach from the group. But I'm thinking from a fantasy football standpoint, right? When we look at ADP, what we're seeing is Juju goes first. He's usually in like the 6th-ish, 7th round. And then a little bit later, Skyy Moore and Marquez Valdes-Scantling kind of hover around together. And then later than that, we got Mecole Hardman. What are you seeing as a Chiefs specialist in terms of how the target pecking order is going to lay out after Travis Kelce, of course? How are you seeing that wide receiver room shake out?
They've been experimenting quite a bit. MVS had a really nice offseason of the OTAs. That doesn't necessarily equate. We've seen some kind of a shuck games there in past seasons. Sure. In the end, it's not necessarily about the targets. It's what you're manufacturing with them. And what you're going to get is MVS on the go routes, on the deep overs, on the things that he's good at. You're going to see more 50-50 ball from Patrick Mahomes this year. We're not sure exactly how much, but the way that it's breaking out for us as we kind of dive deep into this, multiple 1,000-yard receivers are going to be hard to find. I think Patrick is still going to be the top of his game. He could even push for 5,000 yards again, but it's going to be so spread out. Travis Kelce is going to be your number one target machine. Beyond that, it's going to be, in our opinion, me and my staff have kind of broke it all down. MVS, in terms of yardage, we feel very confident in that he will be the number one actual wide receiver. But we do feel like Juju's going to get more of the touchdown attention in the red zone kind of thing. So again, it splits your interest in Chiefs receivers, because I don't think there's any one weapon that they're going to be able to concentrate on. They have to get away from what they saw last season.
Yeah, totally. And it's interesting that you say that about MVS, you think being the yardage leader. I think a lot of people are drafting Juju Smith-Schuster with the understanding that he's the new wide receiver one. And in Kansas City, of course, that's super exciting. But like you said, it's going to be more of a committee's maybe not the right word, but it's going to be more of a group effort, and everybody kind of plays their part. What about the rook? What about the kid? How are you feeling about Skyy Moore entering year one?
Everybody is trying to hold back just a little bit, because he looks the part. They're going to use him in a way that really adapts and makes the most out of his strengths. But I don't think he's going to be a phenom here till later in the season. He might be a good fantasy playoff kind of pickup that maybe you don't carry the whole year. I really don't know. The dark horse is Mecole Hardman. They call him the Jet for a reason, and he is apt to show that he wants a second contract. He wants to stay in Kansas City. He's got to actually perform. He needs to push to be number 2 in either yards or TDs, or maybe both, behind the other 2 more experienced guys. So keep an eye on him. Interesting.
I like it. Yeah, he's kind of the forgotten man at this point, right? You see the Chiefs go out and bring in 2 free agents and a new draft pick. I think a lot of people just kind of assume Mecole Hardman's on the outs, with this being his last year on the team. So that's super interesting. I might have to bump him up a couple tiers in my draft kits.
He'll start over Skyy Moore, just so you know.
Okay. See, very good to know. And that makes sense, right? Obviously the experience over the rookie, that makes sense. And Skyy Moore, by the way, I can't remember if I told you this before, Ryan, big Packers fan over here. I was banging the table I wanted him so bad. And like,
you did okay. You got a Bison. You're fine.
I do like Christian Watson, but at the time I was like, man, they traded up. Skyy Moore would have been there. I was pretty bummed out, but fantasy football standpoint, I'm excited about the kid for the next decade. Yeah. Real quick, I want to hop over to Travis Kelce, right? Obviously, he's been a stud in fantasy football for the last, gosh knows how long. It's been over half a decade now at this point. But I have seen a narrative floating around out there on Reddit, on Twitter, on other forms of social media that Tyreek Hill is gone. Now, a lot of people are scared that Travis Kelce is just suddenly going to get like double teamed into oblivion and suddenly be kind of frustrating from a fantasy football standpoint. I don't see it that way. I'm seeing it the opposite, where the guy's just going to hog targets. But what are you seeing on your side as a Chiefs specialist?
No, I think Reddit's right. Especially like the first quarter of the season, teams are going to attempt to take Travis away. The last 2 years, it's always been an option. Try to take away Tyreek, or do you take away Kelce? And some have gone in the Kelce direction already. And now, without a proven target outside, they're going to concentrate on him. It's going to be up to the other receivers to make them get out of that habit. So he may not have the best matchups, the best production early in the season, the first 4 or 5 games. After that, there's going to be enough attention that pulls away that double, and they're going to make that harder to do. And then I think he'll be back to his old self. I think he's a 1,000-yard receiver. I think he's a 10 touchdown guy this season.
I love that, man. That's something for me to make sure that we come back to once week 2, week 3 rolls around. If he is off to a slow start, maybe we'll repurpose the content and float it back out there so that people realize, hey, okay, don't panic.
Right.
Better times are ahead. Last question here for you, Ryan. The other, we talked about the offensive line as a spot that a lot of people probably don't think about in fantasy football. Same thing with the defensive side of the ball. I think, obviously people are thinking, Jalen Ramsey and some of those shutdown corners. But if I have a wide receiver that I'm playing against the Chiefs, is there anybody on the side of the ball that I need to be worried about if I'm using them against Kansas City?
I think this is going to be a big year for L'Jarius Sneed. A kid that came in as a 4th-round pick and just blew everybody away. Stayed steady last season, didn't see that big leap. Now in year 3, he's going to be the most talented corner they have on this roster. He's likely to travel with number 1 receivers this year because they're not locked in due to the departure of Charvarius Ward. They're not locked into playing one side of the ball or the other. So look for that. If you've got a number 2 matchup against the Chiefs, I think you got to like it because you're most likely going to get Lonnie Johnson, Rashad Fenton, or maybe Trent McDuffie, depending on where the alignment is. And I think you can probably get some points out of that.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah, man, that's super helpful. I'll keep that in mind come week 1 DFS. So that sounds good. The last question I had for you as far as defense goes, when you think about IDP players, right? Not many of us play IDP, but some do. Who's going to get statistics on the defensive side of the ball that we need to be aware of?
If you're a heavy tackle, like I play in a 20-team 4 IDP kind of league. Right?
All right.
Tackles are money, and Nick Bolton is your man. Came in at 112 last year. He's going to up that this year. The defense is, especially with the lack of pass rush on the outside, everything's funneling to the middle linebacker this year. They're brought in a nice rookie that's going to add some added pressure, but it's still going to be Nick Bolton manning the middle. In terms of stats, that's where you want to go. On the passing defense, it's going to be L'Jarius Sneed will have the most PBUs and INTs, maybe backed up secondly by Juan Thornhill, who is predicting himself an all-pro season. He's feeling really good. We'll see if he can pull it off.
Yeah, man, I love it. That all sounds that's super good to know, especially for the IDP players that are listening in. That's a wrap. That's all I got for you for today's conversation. Again, anybody who's listening, please make sure you head over to Twitter, give Ryan a follow. It's Ryan Tracy NFL. It's at Ryan Tracy NFL. Also check out rogueapc.com. Check out sign up for that newsletter over on NFL33.com. And then again, that YouTube channel that I stumbled across there, RGR Football is one of the better YouTube channels I've seen, especially as it pertains to Chiefs football. So Ryan, sure, man, thank you so much for hopping on here. I really appreciated having you on. Again, second guest I've ever had over here. Thanks for jumping on here.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Take care.
All right, man. Take care. So there you have it. Really cool to have Ryan on the show to talk Chiefs football from a fantasy football standpoint. And he definitely raised some eyebrows and raised some items that we need to be thinking about and have on our radar as we head into fantasy football draft season in August, right? We talked about the wide receiver room and how it's going to be much more of a balanced attack than it's been in the past. We talked about MVS possibly leading the team in yards while Juju leads the team in touchdowns. What do we do with that from a fantasy football standpoint? We also talked about Mecole Hardman as a dark horse to be the Chiefs wide receiver 1 heading into 2022. We talked about some potential early frustration from Travis Kelce managers and people who have Travis Kelce on the roster. We talked about a balanced approach from the running back, but one thing we do know for certain, the Kansas City Chiefs are going to be one of the more exciting teams in football, and they're going to be one of the teams that you want to target in fantasy football. They're certainly going to get you fantasy points along the way. That's a wrap on today's show, episode 12, Kansas City Chiefs with Ryan Tracy from Locked On Chiefs. Thank you so much for being here. Please be sure to rate and review the show, or if you're on YouTube, please be sure to like and subscribe. And if you haven't yet, be sure to check out that Chiefs fantasy football preview that I wrote. I will drop a link to it in the description in this podcast. Thank you so much for being here. Cheers. This brew's for you.